Well, Scott and I planned to be here today to revisit the education plan that we rolled out during the state fair and underscore some of the points that we made, specifically the bold plan that we laid out for school choice and keeping politics out of the classroom. It doesn't seem like the Minnesota Department of Education can keep politics out of anything. And I think that you guys deserve an apology because the story keeps changing. I think people in Minnesota deserve an apology. And everybody deserves to know the truth. And some of you were here on Thursday when we drew attention to a pattern of behavior from Tim Walz. And then we called for the resignation of Heather Mueller from the Minnesota Department of Education. Well, now, I think just today, Jeremy Miller called for the resignation of Heather Mueller as well. I want to read something that Tim Walz said when he appointed Heather Mueller Education Commissioner on April 1st, 2021. He said, "Because of the special trust and confidence I have in your integrity, judgment, and ability, I have appointed you to the office of Commissioner of the Department of Education." Integrity, judgment, and ability. Yes, good judgment is a characteristic of good leadership, and Tim Walz has shown to have very poor judgment. $250 million, and that's just the beginning. $250 million. Let's think about this for a second. What does it cost to serve a meal to a child? Let's say it's $2.50. I think it's less than that, but if it's $2.50, that's 100 million meals. 100 million times that a kid was hungry and didn't get a meal from this program. Maybe they didn't get a meal anywhere. Maybe they were fortunate enough to find one somewhere else. Obviously, defrauding the government is wrong. But when you do it at the expense of hungry kids, the only adjectives for me that come to mind, I can't say in front of you guys. But when $250 million goes missing in the private world, this is a fireable offense. But the thing is, in the private world, nobody would get fired for losing $250 million. You know why? Because they would have enough dignity and self-respect that they would quit. They would quit knowing that they don't deserve to keep their job. Well, I think people in politics, they don't quit. And so it's up to Minnesotans on November 8th to fire Tim Walz and Peggy Flanagan and the rest of them.
Thank you all for coming. I would echo Matt Burke's comments that I think, in a way, the media does deserve an apology. You've dug and you've been stonewalled, and you've tried to figure out exactly what's happened in regards to this Feeding Our Future program. So here we are. We spoke with you on Thursday, never imagining that on Friday we would see the virtually unprecedented action by the Minnesota judiciary to issue a statement. At this point in time, in light of all that's happened, I think it's appropriate for all Minnesotans, and Matt and I will lead the charge, but we need to call for a special investigator to look into this situation. The investigation should probably take place through the legislative auditor's coordination. I would personally suggest a fellow like Jim Nobles, former member, highly regarded, identified as a nonpartisan individual, respected by both Democrats and Republicans alike. But I think Minnesotans, in the midst of arguably one of the most intense campaigns in its recent history, I think Minnesotans deserve to have this issue investigated and transparently shared with Minnesotans. So I would ask that we call for a special investigator to give a report by October 17th so that Minnesotans can chew on it, and then at the debates on October 18th and 28th, we can have a conversation including that topic. Let me read to you what the statement from the Minnesota Judicial Branch was on Friday. Judge Guthman never issued an order requiring the Minnesota Department of Education to resume food reimbursement payments to Feeding Our Future. The Department of Education voluntarily resumed payments and informed the court that Feeding Our Future program resolved the serious deficiencies that prompted the Minnesota Department of Education to suspend payments temporarily. All of the Minnesota Department of Education food reimbursement payments to Feeding Our Future were made voluntarily without any court order, the statement said. I think it does help all Minnesotans to recognize that in this program, the Department of Education was tasked with addressing two specific things: applications for feeding sites and payments. In regards to the payments, Judge Guthman and the Minnesota Judicial Branch makes it very clear that they never told the Department of Education to make payments. So let's continue. I think the following questions have to be asked. What did Governor Walz know? When did he learn what he knew? When did he decide to use a district court judge as a scapegoat for his administration and the Department of Education? And lastly, in the midst of convoluted comments on Friday afternoon from the governor's office, who is he trying to protect? Is he trying to protect Heather Mueller, who clearly did not get the job done? Or is this just raw politics, and he's protecting his campaign? I want to single out three different lies. Number one. Lie number one. In February 2022, Judge Guthman begins to be falsely accused of ordering the Minnesota Department of Education to resume payments. The truth? Judge Guthman never ordered payments to resume, and the Minnesota Department of Education voluntarily resumed payments. No such court order exists. Lie number two. In a September 2022 press conference last week, Governor Walz called the non-existent ruling unbelievable and said he was speechless when he was told about it. He also said he obviously had to honor it, this non-existent ruling. And he then publicly called for an investigation into Judge Guthman. The truth, as has been established by court records, there never was such a ruling. Tim Walz invented a scenario in which he was told about a non-existent ruling and then doubled down and called for a sitting judge to be investigated for an action that never took place. Lie number three. In response to Judge Guthman's rebuke, Walz's administration issued a statement that claimed the court made it clear that if Minnesota Department of Education were to continue the legal fight to withhold payments, the Minnesota Department of Education would incur sanctions and legal penalties. The truth? The court never held the Minnesota Department of Education in contempt for payments to the Feeding Our Future program. They were never punished for this because the court actually denied the Feeding Our Future's claims to restart payments, as it was moot. A very brief period of time had passed where the department had not made the payments, and they resumed the payments on their own. The rulings were in December of 2020 and in June of 2021. But in the spring, in those 6 months in between, in March and April, is where the Department of Education unilaterally made the decision to suspend placement payments and then restart them. And they also assured the court that the concerns that they had been resolved. The court never held the Department of Education in contempt for payments to Feeding Our Future. It is clear from incontrovertible evidence that Tim Walz and his administration have engaged in a cover-up. Someone's not telling the truth. Minnesotans deserve to know why. $250 million is the floor. There have been reputable sources that indicate that this could rise to $500 million or even $1 billion. What's unclear is what is Governor Walz trying to hide? Who is he trying to protect? At the end of the day, Minnesotans need to understand that the waste and fraud associated with Feeding Our Futures program diminishes Minnesota, and our reputation for excellence in government has been devastated. And the victims of these unconscionable actions certainly include hungry children, parents, teachers, and all Minnesotans. And even the media, in your efforts to uncover the truth, while you've been stonewalled and told that you're looking in the wrong direction. I think this is a day that should be somber for all of us. This is not about politics. This is about what does good government look like. This has to be about asking the right questions, and the questions are truly, what did Governor Walz know, and when did he learn it? Who was he trying to protect? And when did he decide to try to hold a district court judge responsible for actions that the Department of Education took that clearly were, at best, short-sighted and lacking due diligence, and at worst, represented nothing more than raw politics in an effort to cover something up that wouldn't look good during a campaign. Be glad to stand for questions.
Earlier, it was stated that the governor and lieutenant governor need to be fired. Early voting's already underway. We're 4 days into that. Do you have any concerns about that?
I have deep concerns about the fact that we have early voting taking place. I've expressed those concerns previously. The governor has indicated that he'll allow a debate 1 month into early voting. I think we're seeing right here, in front of all of us today, why early voting is problematic. Why having a debate 4 weeks into early voting is problematic. I think it was media on Friday and Saturday of the last few days that called out, this is why many media people have concerns about early voting. Because in the last 6 weeks of a campaign, if you've already voted, arguably, you've voted with potentially a remarkable and dramatic lack of information.
And debates, if I could follow up on that, do you think this pushes the governor to add debates? Would you be willing to add debates yet to the calendar?
The question is, how do I feel this might motivate or change Governor Walz's response to having debates? I've been confused by Governor Walz's actions on debates. In 2010, there were 26 debates. In 2014, there were half a dozen. In 2018, there were somewhere around half a dozen. In 2018, when Tim Walz was going against Jeff Johnson, at this point in time, there were already 4 or 5 that had been done. And along comes this year, and evidently taking a page out of Joe Biden's playbook, is a preferred course for Tim Walz. So I'm not certain how it will impact. Perhaps he'll cancel those 2 debates.
What about statewide TV? I know you singled out in particular 2 of the offers that were for statewide television. How important is that?
People in Minnesota need to understand that when it comes to these debates, the only thing I've been able to say to it is, yes, I will make that date work, and yes, I will bring coffee and donuts. But in terms of not allowing a live audience, Tim Walz made that decree. In terms of not allowing Minneapolis and St. Paul TV to have the October 18th debate broadcast, and instead it's only going to be in greater Minnesota and it will not include Minneapolis and St. Paul, that was Tim Walz's decree.
Well, Senator, if the local stations in the Twin Cities can pick up that feed, they're choosing not to. Shouldn't you be asking them to pick up that feed?
I think you should be asking them to pick up that
Well,
feed.
okay.
My understanding in the invitation that we received was that it was going to be co-sponsored by, I think, 4 different networks around greater Minnesota, and that Minneapolis and St. Paul weren't included. But if Minneapolis and St. Paul can pick up that feed, I would certainly hope that you would do your job and make sure that they do. Absolutely.